Today I wanted to do something a bit different. So, Ollie, Joni Mitchell's discography spans over 40 years and 20 albums. And if you picked one of those albums at random to listen to, having never heard her music before, you could be left with any one of a number of very different impressions of what she sounds like. And there are some reasons for this. Like, firstly, Joni was never content to rest on her laurels musically. She was always developing and changing her sound. But beyond that, she was taking control of her future in a way that not many musicians like her were able to do at that time. And as a result, I think she should be considered as pop music's first female auteur. So you may be asking, what does this mean? Like, what's an auteur? There goes Jamie again, using big words he's stolen from film.
Yeah, I'm glad you're explaining this one, lad.
I knew you'd pick up on it.
For me and the listeners.
Exactly. Well, what I mean is that Joni was the first major female pop artist who was able to define herself on her own terms, outside of label and industry pressure. And she did this by taking complete ownership of her sound, and then using that control to subvert expectations from album to album. So she demanded, essentially, that she be taken as seriously as her male contemporaries. You know, the Bob Dylans, the Neil Youngs, the Paul Simons of this world, whatever. And Ollie, I think Joni should be absolutely fucking commended for having the bravery to switch up her sound and pursue what she wanted to pursue in the face of, let's be honest, like pretty rampant misogyny. To give some examples of that, after the release of Blue, Rolling Stone wrote an article describing Joni as the Queen of LA, and then they also called her the Old Lady of the Year. Essentially, they were trying to dismiss her as just like another girlfriend or muse to more important male artists. They even published a diagram of supposedly heartbroken lovers and how they all connected back to Joni. So she made Blue, this unbelievable album, and in exchange she got slut-shamed in the biggest music magazine in America.
For listeners, you can find that diagram. It's quite a pixelated one on Google Images, but if you Google like Joni Mitchell Rolling Stone, you can find it, and it shocked me that was published. I know it was 1971 and everything, but that was a surprise to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more story to illustrate that point even further. There's an interview where Joni talks about a listening party that her and Bob Dylan had for the new albums in the 70s, because they were on the same label at the time. And this is to quote her: "There was all this fussing over Bobby's project because he was new to the label, and Court and Spark, which was a big breakthrough for me, was being entirely and almost rudely dismissed. Dylan played his album, Planet Waves, and everybody went, oh wow. I played my album, and everybody talked over it, and Bob fell asleep." So, I mean, like, there you go, and you can talk a lot about how her and Bob Dylan ended up falling out, but that's one story. And I could go on with many more stories. I won't, because I've been talking a lot. Instead, I want to open the floor to discussion, Ollie, and ask you, as someone who perhaps hasn't spent as much time as I have fanboying over Joni's later jazz or synth or whatever influenced albums, how do you feel about the way her career progressed and what she faced during it?
I think I've got a great deal of admiration for somebody that isn't bowed or pressured by labels, by management, or just even by peers, you know, and she just continued to work with whoever she wanted to, regardless of kind of all this white noise. I think she released an album in '79 with Charles Mingus, who was kind of, you know, like a revered jazz musician, and everybody told her, steer clear, don't do that, it's bad for your image, it's bad for your career, it's bad for relevance in music, etc, etc. But she wasn't going to be swayed by any of that, and decided to make an album that, you know, she's incredibly proud of. I think another good example would be, I read, for example, that she went on a tour with Van Morrison and Bob Dylan, again, before they'd fallen out. This was a few years back. And apparently Van and Bob Dylan, you know, were playing all their old hits, but she decided to kind of firmly stick to her new album and her new material.
Yeah.
And I think the quote at the time was something like, you know, I'm not a human jukebox. I have a large deal of kind of begrudging respect for that.
And
because
the thing is, it is begrudging, because let's be honest, like this is like, it's amazing that someone can commit to their own development as much as she did, but let's also not pretend that her development necessarily always went in ways that were satisfying for the listener. Like, I love her some of her albums in the 70s as much as anyone, like Hejira, Mingus, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter. They're all amazing. When you start getting into the 80s and into the 90s, she, as you say, in the face of label pressure, in the face of the pressure from her peers, made whatever the fuck she want, and the results weren't always that great. Like, let's be honest, Dog Eat Dog, Night Ride Home, Turbulent Indigo, these are not amazing albums, but like, fair play that she just decided.
But at least they're her own mistakes, aren't they?
That's her own mistakes.
That's one thing you can say. Like, you take your hat off, applaud that. I think, do you know what this reminded me of a little bit? When we went to see Massive Attack a few years ago in Croatia, and I remember they didn't play Teardrop.
Yeah.
And I remember we were chatting at the campsite the day after, and I was kind of like, fuck's sake, man, why don't they play Teardrop?
Or
like,
Unfinished Symphony as well.
Yeah, they didn't. Yeah, exactly. And I remember you said, like, look, man, like, you know, they can play what they want. They've got enough hits. Like, why are you getting vexed about that? And it kind of made me think, like, yeah, do you know what? You were spot on. Like, it's their decision. It's not like they're there purely just to make me happy. Like, surely them as artists, they've got to be, you know, doing what they want to do. And I think ultimately Joni Mitchell will look back on her career and think that.
Yeah, well, the other thing as well is, like, you have to think about what, as a woman, whether she was allowed the same opportunities to do those things as the men were. Because you take someone like Paul Simon, who was, you know, in Simon & Garfunkel, as folky as you can get, and in a really kind of sophomoric sense as well. He moved beyond that kind of singer-songwriter thing and made fucking Graceland, or like the late great Johnny Ace. Those are like completely different albums to what he was known for, and everyone loved him for it. But then when Joni makes Mingus, or, you know, it's not given.
It's a travesty.
Yeah, it's not afforded the same level of respect. And I think that you can't forget that this whole time she was doing all these things, she was doing it as a woman in a man's world. And I think, like, the respect I have for that is unbelievable.